Good evening. Welcome to Practical Conversations, conversations for the life of the church. The life of the church includes not only its proclamation, but also the vibrancy of its people in promotion and enhancement of the kingdom of God. Practical Conversations intends to engage conversations of practice and theology with persons currently working in the church at various levels and engaged in these issues. Our goal is to both inform and encourage those who are actively seeking to enhance God's kingdom through the use of their gifts. Tonight's conversation centers around rethinking ministry, particularly in this post pandemic climate. Our guest tonight is the Reverend LaKesha Womack, who is the founder and CEO of Rethinking Church Ministries based in Charlotte. And we encourage you to follow Rethinking Church on their Facebook page. Now, I have to acknowledge that Reverend Womack has consulted with my congregation, and without her help, we would not have made it through the shutdown. So I can publicly thank her for that. Our chat is open. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can just put those into the chat and we will answer those as we can. We encourage you to engage with this conversation tonight. Reverend Womack, welcome to Practical Conversations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Broadnax. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
We're glad to have you. Now, let's begin. You and I have been discussing some of the trends that were leading us in, well, I shouldn't say leading us into the pandemic, but some of the trends that were taking place in ministry before the pandemic. Talk about what some of those were.
Yes, I think one of the biggest trends was, the use of digital media for ministry. And, we had a lot of churches that were very resistant to, embracing Facebook, embracing having a website. And they were saying, oh, no, we don't need all of that. And ironically, I was in Tennessee at a conference right before, I would say weeks before the pandemic. And one of the pastors said, oh, no, like I need people to come in the church because I need to put my hands on them. And I was like, well, that's problematic in a lot of areas, but primarily, we saw, TD Jakes and we saw Joel Osteen and we saw them using digital media to build their ministries. And it was, really fascinating to me how there were people all over the world that were engaging with their churches online. And you couldn't tell those people that they were not members of their churches. And so, it was just kind of like asking our churches like, hey, let's maybe take a look at what is happening and to see how we could use it, especially for some of our churches that were starting to experience a decrease in membership. Like, this may be an opportunity, but there was a lot of resistance because we didn't want to let go of tradition in favor of innovation.
Okay. So how has the pandemic changed that, or what has the pandemic done to either help us to rethink what we're doing or in some ways, left us behind?
Yeah. Well, I think, there are some churches that have gotten left behind because they failed to embrace technology. And I think that there is this mindset that the church doesn't have to compete for members. And what we have found is, traditionally, especially when the A.M.E. Zion Church was established, there were not a lot of church options. So a lot of people went to the church that their family went to. They went to the church that was closest to them. But now there are more options. And so churches do have to, on some level, compete. And it's not like, oh, we have to, be better than the next church. But we do have to identify what are the needs of the people that we're trying to serve. And are we truly meeting those needs? Because we can no longer take for granted that people are just going to come to our church because they've always come, because now there's a church on every corner, but there's also a stream of churches in their Facebook feed. There's a stream of churches on YouTube. So people can access a worship service 24/7 and they don't have to be in space. And so churches who are, succeeding right now are the churches who've done the hard work to say, what is it that we need to do to ensure that the people that we want to engage with, that we're actually meeting their needs?
Now, I want to ask you about something that may sound somewhat strange or even difficult for some congregations, but it sounds like you're saying that the church operates in a marketplace.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. And when you think about it in that context, and I always use the example that, I'm 46, and ever since I was a little girl, I've wanted to eat a Big Mac. And McDonald's has not changed the Big Mac. If anything, it may have gotten smaller. The Big Mac does not change, but over time, they do marketing campaigns to make sure that 46 years later, I still want to eat the Big Mac. The church is one of the only industries that says we're not going to change. We're not going to adapt our marketing. We're not going to adapt what we're doing, but we want you to continue consuming it and giving us money for it without taking any consideration to, is it meeting the needs? Is it something that's still appealing to people? And the thing is, it's not about the gospel, but it's about how do we create an experience that people want to be a part of? How do we create a community that people want to be a part of? And when we fail to do that work, there are other churches who are doing the work. And so it's not that people are leaving church or they're leaving God behind. They're leaving our churches and going to those churches who are attempting to meet their needs.
One of the things that is disconcerting to me as a theologian is that people don't go to church for doctrine anymore.
Right.
My doctrine, your doctrine, that really doesn't matter. They're looking for other things. Talk about how we can do the kind of marketing that we need to do, and not focus so much on our traditions, even our doctrines for that matter, because that doesn't attract people like it used to.
Right. Well, I think one of the misconceptions that people have when they hear rethinking church, they think that, I'm advocating for us, take out the altars and, we got to focus more on entertainment, when I'm much more of a traditionalist. I think we need to go back to teaching people how to worship. So often, like, our churches have become spaces of entertainment. And then when people are not entertained and they leave to go find entertainment, we're like, oh no, like, I don't understand. But it's like, if that's what you market, if that's what you're putting out, you can't be mad when that's what people are looking for. But when we teach people how to worship, when we teach them how to be reverent in the space of God, when we teach them how to kneel at the altar, when we teach them those things, then that's what they will start to look for. But I think that we've subconsciously trained people to focus more on the entertainment. So it's about the preaching, it's about the choir, it's about the singing. And then we say, well, we don't have time for the Apostles' Creed, and we don't need another prayer, and we don't need to read scripture. When in my mind, those are the things that help to bring people closer to God versus the things that are more entertaining. So I think we have to do a little bit of introspection about what are we subconsciously training people to come to church looking for? And then when we stop providing that, why do we get mad at people because that's what they're looking for?
I should have said at the beginning that our conversation tonight is to highlight some of the articles in the upcoming October edition of the Quarterly Review. That edition should be hitting your mailboxes within the next couple of days. Reverend Womack's article is the lead article in this edition, and wonderful quote she has here. She says, our ministry should strategically understand how to maintain our traditions while embracing innovation. Talk about that, if you will.
Yes, I don't think that it's an either or, but it's definitely a both and. So one of the issues that I think is a little perplexing to me is when we look at the education system in the United States and just the direction that it's moving in, with banning books and, students not being able to read, and the literacy, math literacy, students being left behind because of the pandemic. Then it makes me wonder, like, why do we not go back to our roots, where our roots were us teaching our community, us teaching our children? And it seems like, again, like, we favor entertainment. Like, how do we keep the kids entertained when is church a space for entertainment, or is it a space for education? So Christian education is not just about teaching the Bible, but how do you combine that with literacy? How do you combine that with tools that will help people to have a better quality of life? Why are we not doing more workforce development? Why are we not, promoting entrepreneurship in the church? When we look at the church before the civil rights era, the church was the space where people came for information, where they came to build community. And we somehow got disconnected from that. And now churches are in communities, but the communities are not in the churches, because we have failed to look at how do we continue to be relevant, and not just because we want to extract from the community, but because we want the community to come and use our space. But it feels like, the fellowship hall is so fancy and the sanctuary is so nice that, unless you're paying us money, you can't use our space. But I thought like we existed so that we could serve the community and not be served by the community. And so when I say like embracing the traditions, it's going back to what were the things that the church was doing that made the church popular, that made people want to come to church. How do we get back to doing that, but in an innovative way that meets the needs of people today?
Another thing you say in your article is that church leaders must reflect and rethink how to minister in a society that evolves as quickly as a platform can change from Twitter to X.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and so there are some pastors that, meet with a small group, once a week or maybe once a month to do some reflections. What's working, what's not working. And I feel like so many times, we have church leaders who feel like they can't be corrected, that, whatever they're doing, like it's got to be the right thing because I guess, God drops all the right answers into their spirit. I don't know how that works, but, they're not getting any feedback from, the congregation, any critical feedback to say, hey, like maybe we should think about doing this differently. Maybe we should think about doing that. Like there's no willingness to change until we get to annual conference. It's like, all right, now it's a new year. We're going to do our organizational meeting. But why are we not doing that on a more regular basis to see like, all right, if this isn't working, if people aren't coming, what can we do differently? And the biggest thing we can do is ask people. What is it that you love about the church? Like there's the appreciative inquiry model that I've been leading some retreats on, where it doesn't start with the problem, but asking, what do we do well? Whatever we're doing well, what is it that people love about our church? Let's focus on doing more of that instead of focusing on the problems and all the things that's wrong and how do we fix it, which can get people depressed and overwhelmed. But when you start thinking about what do we do well, what do people love about our church, let's continue to do that. Let's find more ways to do that in the community. Then people start to get excited. So that's one of the suggestions that I have for churches. Like think about what you're doing well and don't be afraid to change. Like if it's not working, stop doing it.
You mentioned that you have a survey you're working with. Can people gain access to that if they contact you through your website or Facebook page?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. On the screen at some point, you should see links to both of those, both the website for Rethinking Church Strategies and the Facebook page. Not only in this conversation, but in the quarterly review for October. Any ideals, any things that you're thinking about that have sparked you, and that's really what we were trying to do with this edition, to spark interest or to spark conversation. If you have something, please contact Reverend Womack and her team, and they'll be more than happy to help you. Another article that we have in our edition this month is on the digital mission field. Yeah. And I like the title of that because we think of the mission field as going off to some country or some other territory, but the writer here, Jennifer Benton, speaks of the digital space as a mission field and a means by which we can do evangelism. Help us understand how that works.
Yeah, so again, going back to churches not really wanting to embrace technology, and the concept first came to me in 2016. The World Methodist Conference invited me to their convention to present on using social media for global evangelism. And I had the epiphany that for the first time in the history of civilization, we could truly fulfill the Great Commission using social media, because people from all over the world are using digital media right now. And so we don't have to just wait until we can save enough money to go somewhere, but we can actually, minister to a global community using technology. But we can also minister to younger people. We can minister to homebound people. And I think that when we think about people not coming to church, there's often an assumption that people don't come to church because they're lazy, they're uninterested. And we forget that there are people who are in the military, they're stationed overseas. There are people who may have relocated. There are people who, may have a job that they have to work on Sundays, because jobs are not just Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 anymore. There are college students who are away from home. There are people who are homebound, people who are caring for people who are homebound. So there are a plethora of reasons why people are not always coming to church on Sunday. And so digital media allows us to use those tools and platforms as an opportunity to stay connected with people. And and not just make assumptions about why people aren't attending, but say, not only do we want you to be in space with us, but if you say suffer from social anxiety, because that's also an issue. People have social anxiety. They don't like being around a lot of people. There are people who have health challenges and they're still afraid of COVID and the next outbreak. So not making assumptions that just because people don't want to be in physical space, that we no longer have an opportunity or even an obligation to disciple them. So using technology does not replace the opportunity for people to come to church, but it provides another vehicle. And sometimes people build community with churches that will make them say, yeah, I can't wait to go. There are people that I know of who have traveled to cities to go to churches that they've been watching online because they've become a part of that community and they want to meet the people in person. Whereas there are people who are down the street from your church that don't even want to come because there's no connection. They haven't built any community with you.
You are watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. Our guest tonight is the Reverend LaKesha Womack, who is the founder and CEO of Rethinking Church Ministries. Our conversation tonight both centers around the upcoming issue of the A.M.E. Quarterly Review, but also around the issues of rethinking ministry in the post-pandemic climate. We're so happy to have Reverend Womack tonight. We were discussing the digital mission field, and one of the things that really struck me about that article is the strategy around Instagram. Mm-hmm. You know, I have young people who are Instagramming my church. Well, my church has an Instagram page which one of my young people runs, and I'm constantly getting dinged on, what's going on Instagram. But one of the things that really struck me were some of the strategies that were talked about in terms of using video and using notes and sermon highlights that can both engage persons and, reach out to others who are not part of our ministry. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, most definitely. I think a lot of times when we think about using social media, the content that we put out is typically geared toward people who already have some level of understanding about the church. But sometimes when you pull out those highlights, then you can answer questions that people who may, or ask questions that people who may not have any context would be like, I wonder what that means. And then you have a link for them to go and get more information. So it's not always about us giving answers, but sometimes just pulling out information that causes people to think, because I truly believe that critical thinking in America is sorely lacking because we're so focused on always giving people the answer. But how do we, take sermon clips that make people say, wow, I want to know more about that, or that makes them start to make their little gears start to turn a little bit and say, let me go watch more, let me learn more. Because I think so often it's the negative clips that end up going viral, because the preachers who are doing the good work and the good, exegesis, their clips are not always being shown. It's only the stuff that's sensational. And we're just like, oh my God, I can't believe this is the thing that people know the church for. But I think that, more of our, practical theologians should be putting out content that will go viral and encouraging their members to share it, encouraging their communities to share it so that it does get seen by a wider audience. So it's not just the sermon, but also, using graphics, using text, because people learn in different ways. So how can you take one sermon, which for you, could be a good 30-35 minutes, but your social media team can take that content and spread it out over the course of a week that can help to have content, but also to help engage people.
All right, so you're gonna make me climb on top of my soapbox now. All right, one of my pet peeves is whenever I'm on Facebook and I see some clip of somebody's sermon, it's always their clothes, and they're running up and down the aisle, and I have no idea what the sermon was. It's just whatever they're, your focus on content, at least for me, is important, but I'm sure for a lot of other persons as well.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the difference between trying to entertain people and educate people. So a lot of times we want to put out the content that's entertaining and not thinking about, but how do we educate people? How do we raise the consciousness of people? How do we provide information that will make them say like, wow, I never thought about scripture from that perspective. Maybe I should go look at that scripture again, or maybe I should go listen to the rest of the sermon. I think it was Dr. Otis Moss the third who was doing a presentation for us, and he was talking about something and somebody said, yeah, doc, that's good teaching. And I realized that what they were saying was he was interpreting the scripture in a way they hadn't heard before. And so often we want to put out the things that people have heard before because we think that resonates with them, instead of how about let's take in the things that people haven't heard before that will pique their interest and make them want to learn more versus just feeding what they already know.
Yeah, you're right. Right. Let me say that our chat is open for anyone who has any questions or comments. We would love for you to engage with this conversation. So please go to our chat with any questions or comments that you may have. You've led us into another article in our issue this month. It's on rethinking Christian education.
Yeah.
What Reverend Bradford says in that article, she uses the analogy of it's not a demolition of the house, but a no demolition of the house, where they don't tear the whole thing down. They just start from its foundation, refortify it, and reframe the foundation, and then build from there. She's suggesting the same thing for Christian education. What do we need to do to refortify and reframe what we're doing? But how then do we build on that for a new generation and a new era?
Yeah. And if you guys have not met Dr. Karen Bradford, I suggest you go look her up. Like, she is just amazing. And before we get to that question, I do want to say that she's the one who opened my eyes to a different way of even teaching Sunday school with our youth, how we can improve like literacy through Sunday school. So definitely look her up. But one of, her premises is that I think, again, thinking about rethinking church, people think that we're saying like, oh no, we have to stop doing all the things that we're doing and do something totally new, when our argument is, let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to the things that were actually working and that were building up a strong moral foundation in our community. Because when you look at the church previous and the stronghold that it had in our communities and the influence that leaders of the church had in the community, it's because they were teaching and getting people to learn, and not just putting out information and entertaining. And so I think a lot of her work centers around how do we do that work of using the parables to get people to understand lessons. So it's not just about you telling me what to do, but causing me to sit back and reflect. Like, sometimes I'm not the good guy in that parable. Sometimes I have to admit, like, maybe like I'm the bad person and I need to do something different. But how do we just go back to our foundations in our teaching, especially with Christian education?
She identifies 5 areas, or shall I say, 5 cornerstones of Christian education. She speaks of law and theology as one. Memory and stories, parables, 2. Prayer is the 3rd. Living is the 4th. And evidence of Jesus' divinity as the 5th. And from these cornerstones, from these foundations, we get, the real foundations of the church and the church's ministry. But then building from there, we want to enter into this new digital, or even, not even the digital, but into this new age of ministry.
Yeah. And I think, using those cornerstones, then you can add the tools. So a lot of times people want to go straight to the innovation, and they want to use Facebook, and they want to use, websites and Instagram and TikTok and all of that. But if you don't have a foundation that is built on, then what separates you from a secular motivational speaker? And so the thing that separates the church from motivational speakers, people who are just, trying to get you to live your best life, and, how do you just be a good person? But how do we be Christians? How do we live lives that are like Christ? Has to do with those cornerstones, where our teaching is not just you want to be a good person, but how do you live like Christ? But we have to understand, what are Christ's teachings? What are our foundational elements that we're then trying to impart into others? And I think that also goes back to discipleship. One of my pastors that I mentor called me, and we were talking, and he was saying, how his church was kind of in a slump, like they weren't seeing as much of an increase as they had been seeing, and he wanted to get more new people coming into the church. And I said, well, I think you should focus on the spiritual growth of the people you already have. Because too often we want to get more people in when we're not growing the people that we already have. If you have people and they're not growing, it's almost like going to a restaurant, and if you leave the restaurant hungry, you're not going to invite someone to come to the restaurant with you. But if you leave that restaurant and your stomach is full and you had a great time and the atmosphere was set, then you're going to tell other people, hey, come to this restaurant and get some of what I had. And a lot of times we're not getting people spiritually full to the point where they want to tell other people, hey, come get some of what I've gotten, because it does feel like just another motivational sermon or just another message that, like, all right, like that was good, but was it so good that it made me want to do something different?
You reminded me of when you came to my church just before the pandemic began, and you talked about the congregation that you were raised in Alabama. You said it's a very small congregation, but they formed you through spiritual growth and faith development. And you just mentioned that, that you were talking to one of the persons that you're currently consulting with, and you said to him, he needs to focus on the development, spiritual development of the people that we have. Talk about how we can better do that in this current climate.
Yeah, I think one is not focusing so much on the leader leading conversations, but encouraging your congregation to have conversation around the text. Too often we don't allow people to interrogate the text themselves, because we as the leaders say, all right, I'm leading the Bible study and I'm leading the Sunday school. But when different people who may not be what you would traditionally think as leaders are asked to, like, hey, maybe this Sunday you lead Sunday school. Read the lesson, share your thoughts. That gets them to exercise their spiritual muscles. And we know what we exercise is what typically grows. But a lot of people are sitting in our congregations and they're sitting back allowing the leadership to do the work and the heavy lifting. So you have a few people in the church who are growing because they're doing all the work, while everyone else is just sitting back kind of operating as spectators. So I don't think that it's about, like, when someone joins the church, we got to put them to work, but we do have to engage them more in the conversation, engage them in, praying out loud in small group, engage them in, all right, so, what scripture are you reading this week? What are you meditating on? How has God showed up in your life? Like, how do you see God in the world? Like, asking them to start meditating and thinking about things of God, because, what's in our heart is what typically comes out. But too often we don't know what's in people's heart. So when they're at the dollar store cursing people out, we're like, oh my God, like that was my member. But we never took the time to see, like, just because it goes in their head doesn't mean it's going into their heart. So how do we make sure that we're having conversations, spiritual conversations with people, to get them to start reflecting and meditating on the things of God? And so I think, there are several ways that you can do that. But one of the biggest ones is just having those spiritual conversations with people. So as a class leader, not just calling to say, hey, how are you doing? How's your family doing? But really asking, how's your devotional life? What are you reading? What scriptures are you meditating on? How is God speaking to you? Some people don't even know how God speaks to them. And so it's like, how can you be a Christian, or how can you say you have this relationship with God that's only one-sided? If you're only talking to God, you're only praying to God, you're only asking God, but you never have the time to sit still and hear from God or to obey God, then are you really in a relationship?
One of the avenues, or one of the focuses of the Rethinking Christian Education article, is particularly geared towards Christian education and to African Americans. What's so important about that?
Christian education for African Americans. I think that, just looking at the history of this country, if we did not have the Black church, if we did not have Christian education, if the church was not I would say the foundation of our educational experiences from the beginning of our time in this country, we would not be as literate or as far along as we are, because the Black church is what started a lot of the schools that we have, started a lot of the institutions, especially social institutions that we have. So It's almost heartbreaking in a sense when you think about how little our ancestors had and how much they built, the foundation that they laid for us. And then you look at the fact that we're now having to sell churches, that we have schools that are underfunded. And it's like, how now that we have so much that we are now at risk of losing it when people who had so little were able to build this? And so I think us going back to being good stewards of our resources. So for me, that's a big part of Christian education, is helping us to not only learn and become literate, biblically literate, financially literate, to be able to read better, but also helping us to become stewardship literate. How do we not only see the blessings that God bestows upon us as our personal blessings, but as communal blessings? How do we become better stewards of the resources that we have, not just the houses and the cars that we're praying for, but the churches that we have, the schools that we have, the institutions that have been established for us, that we're now at risk of 400 years later not even being in existence?
And one of the things that I want to bring out is that we still have a primary need to focus on African American communities.
Yeah.
Not to the exclusion of other communities, but we also have a need to help and uplift our own communities and our
Okay.
own people.
Yeah.
So that there should be a particular focus on African American persons in Christian education, and again, not to the exclusion of other persons who are in our congregations.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, even looking again, going back to what's happening with our education system and like the book bans. And the question is like, just because we're the church doesn't mean we can only read the Bible. Why are we
Mhm.
not encouraging young people to do like book studies on books around history of Black people in this country? Because so often their self-worth is low because they don't know who they are as a people. They believe that our history started when we were brought to this country, but we are from a lineage of great people. And our history did not begin when we came to this country, but even studying the continent of Africa, because Africa is not a country, but it is a continent that is rich in every natural resource that you can imagine, which is why other countries pillage Africa and attempt to destroy it. Because if it truly were to live up to the richness that is embedded in its soil, then people of color would be much more powerful than other people. But that's a conversation for another day. But helping our young people to understand who they are. And there are some people our age who don't even know who we are. And they have fallen into the trap of white supremacy and white nationalism, thinking that white ice is better than Black ice, when we are the ones who built the ice machines. We are the ones who had to freeze the ice and cut the ice up and make the ice cubes. We are the ones who have been the innovators in this country for so long, yet our contributions to this society have been minimalized. And so people are walking around with their heads held down, thinking that we are not a great people when we truly are. And I think that the church should bear some weight in that education and not just relying on educational institutions that we know that are not designed for us to truly succeed, which is why they started to have little problem with desegregation, because they realized that they could then marginalize us in a whole different way because they could control what we were learning. Because when we were teaching ourselves, then we did have more esteem and we did have more self-worth because we knew who we were. So yeah, don't get me started. We can go on all night on that one.
You're watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. Our focus tonight is on rethinking church ministries, particularly in this post-pandemic climate. Our guest tonight is the Reverend LaKesha Womack, who is the founder and the CEO of Rethinking Church Strategies. We're happy to have her tonight, and we're talking about the upcoming edition of the A.M.E. Quarterly Review. That review should be hitting your mailboxes in the next couple of days. And the articles in this particular issue all focus on rethinking a particular aspect of ministry. Let's talk about economic development. You just mentioned our stewardship to our communities. And part of that stewardship is the economic development of that community. As the editor of the Quarterly Review, I have to acknowledge that that was probably the most challenging article for me, because I've never really considered, or at least I'm not very adept at the economics development, economic strategies in the community. Help persons like myself out with that.
Well, I'll just, use one example. So I was out west at one of their leadership institutes, and there was a panel discussion. And one of the preachers said that he had a young adult who was starting a food truck. And he told the young adult that the church was going to support his food truck. And so he went back and he told, the congregation to go support this young man's food truck. And the young man became one of the top tithers in the church. And I think that in our congregations, we have people who are business owners. We have people who are professionals or corporations that we don't always leverage, but then we'll go get an outside person to do something just because we have not taken the time to identify, do we have any insurance agents in the congregation? And if we do, why do we not encourage our members to buy insurance from that person? Do we have any general contractors in the congregation? If so, why are we not encouraging our members to do business with each other? So I think that's an easy starting point because, we're quick to ask them for an ad in the program book. And I call it like we're spiritual gangsters. Like we're not contributing anything, but we want to cut. Like we want 10%, every Sunday. But, what are we doing to help build up the businesses of the people first in our congregations? But then even looking around in the community, what are we doing to support the businesses that are around the church? How are we being good community partners and thinking about how do we also, when there's property available, how do we also start to purchase property? Because we know that no more land is being built. If anything, like they say, like New York is about to go underwater. So we're possibly about to lose, lose land. So, how are we looking at opportunities to, purchase property to become owners and not always renters? Instead of selling property, why don't we look at how do we maybe lease that space? Because there are opportunities where you can lease your space and have like 100-year lease where that company is paying you money for it. And then you can take that and maybe go relocate into a different area. So just thinking, more strategically about our economic opportunities and not always looking at short dollars, but how do we look at long money? How do we look at opportunities for us to create wealth in our communities as well as in our congregations?
When you spoke of the church helping to support a young person who was getting a food truck, it made me think of microloans.
Yeah.
I've heard of micro loans working in quote unquote underdeveloped nations, but how well do they work in the United States?
Oh, they work really well. So, one of the projects of Rethinking Church is working toward next year is to become a CDFI. So we want to be a micro loan fund for Black businesses. And what that means is like there's a certain segment of our society who does not have bad credit, but they don't have good credit. So they're in that fair credit rating. And in that rating, it's really hard to get a bank loan. It's hard to get a credit card because you typically have to pay higher interest rates. So for some people, they just need somewhere between $500 and $5,000 that can have a tremendous impact on their business. So that might be the difference between me having like, a HD camera or a 5 HD or whatever the cameras are called. But, it can make the difference between me being here in my business and being able to increase my pricing. So for some people, being able to access those micro loans, and especially if you're working with a micro lender that reports to the credit bureau, then while you have that micro loan, it can also report to the credit bureau, help build up your credit scores so that by the time you pay it off, your business becomes stabilized, then you're able to apply for other credit opportunities. But typically with CDFIs and these micro loan programs, they also provide technical assistance. So it's not just that you get the money, but there's also some training that goes along with it. And there are a lot of like Black Business Accelerator programs that exist that are doing this now. And if you guys are not aware, there was a recent lawsuit against the Fearless Fund Foundation, which is an organization that provides grants to Black women business owners. And so there was someone who came and said, it's not fair that this organization is only supporting Black women because that's discrimination.
Right.
And so they're now even trying to take that opportunity away because they see how advantageous it is to our community when we're able to fund our own initiatives and not always have to go and be discriminated against to try to get access to capital.
How can churches be a part of this? How can churches help by giving small loans?
Yeah, so churches can actually become CDFI. So you can establish a separate entity, and you don't have to be a certified CDFI. So and I'm gonna try not to get too technical with this, but you could actually establish a loan fund, and you can have your members to donate into this loan fund, and then you can provide micro loans to members of your community, members of the church, and then they pay those funds back. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the A.M.E churches, and I think it's the Episcopal district in the Midwest, they actually have a loan fund for churches who are not able to get bank financing. They can actually borrow from the Episcopal district loan fund, and they pay that money back. And as they pay it back, they're able to make other loans. And while they're paying the money back, they're helping them to get their financials together. They're helping them to figure out why they got denied, and whatever that reason is, they're helping them to make some corrections. So they provide that level of technical assistance as well. So there are lots of opportunities for us to not be always the borrower, but to also become the lender. And it seems like there's like scripture that talks about that somewhere. Like, I don't know, I'm not a biblical scholar, but a lot of this is, biblical. And we want to highlight the things that deal with just the moral issues. So, we want to beat our drums on, but there's also scripture that talks about how do we deal with finances? How do we deal with business? How do we interact with each other as far as like commerce exchange? And it's not just about people being slaves, but how do we actually support each other from a community aspect? And that is a part of it. And yes, stop expecting members to provide free services, right? Because so often like the church is like always in need, and it's like, but at what point do we become a blessing? At what point do we stop always asking for more and more and more, and we start investing in the people who are sitting in our congregations, instead of always going out looking to pay other people, but then expecting our members to work for free?
Now, let me see if I got the acronym correctly. Is it CDFI?
Yes, and it's a community development fund institution. And
Well,
you can actually like look it up online and get more information about CDFIs.
Well, what I wanted to emphasize is that, I'm sitting here having the conversation with you, and I'm not sure I got it right. So I'm not sure that persons listening to the conversation will get the acronym correctly. But what I want you to do is across your screen, you see the address to her website, also the Facebook page. Anything that you didn't quite get or something that wasn't quite clear for you tonight, hit her up. Go to the Facebook page. Go to her website. She'll be more than happy to help you and to clarify anything that we're discussing tonight. In the article on economic development, one of the pillars that the author, and let me scroll back up here to make sure I get his name correct.
Brother Chuck Williams, I got
Thank you. Oh, no. This one is actually from Dr. Leroy McKenzie.
Oh, okay. Yes, Dr. Leroy McKenzie.
Okay.
Because we
One
had
of
two,
the pillars that he speaks of is government. Now, when I first read that, I'm thinking, why does the church have to get involved in government? But that's not what he's emphasizing. What he's emphasizing here is the church advocating for policies and things in the community that will better the community. He advocates for us to be more involved by participating in school meetings, local councils, of course, by registering and voting in all elections. These are the kinds of things in which our members can be very active in their local governments, and that helps to empower both the church and the community.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think one of the biggest lies that the Black church has bought into is the fact that the church cannot be involved in politics. And the reason that I say it's a lie, because there's this phrase that I hear quite often, which is something around like white Christian conservatives.
Yeah.
So if they can tie their Christianity to their political ideology, then why is it that we're so afraid to tie our Christianity to our political ideology? So it's not about supporting a specific candidate, which they have absolutely no problem doing, but it is about us being more cognizant of the candidates that we are supporting and the policy issues that we are supporting, and us not getting co-opted into issues that have absolutely nothing to do with with the Black community just because someone says, well, morally, this thing is wrong. And it's like, wait. Morally, that may be wrong, but that's not an issue that we're dealing with. And we need to make sure that we stay focused on the issues that we're dealing with and holding our elected officials accountable to those issues. Because so often people will come to the Black church because they know that we have influence in the community, and they will get us all riled up and worked up over issues that have nothing to do with us. But then when our issues come to the table, we're like, all right, it's our turn. Then we look to the left and we look to the right, and there's nobody standing with us. So I think we have to use our political capital to be more focused on the issues that affect our communities and our people. And then if we have some extra time, then let's go work on your issues. But we need to keep our issues at the forefront, because there's no reason that we are still fighting for voting rights. There's no reason that most of our communities are the ones that are being gentrified. That doesn't happen overnight. Most cities have 20, 30-year strategic plans, but because we're not going to county commission meetings, we're not going to city council meetings, we're not going to the Board of Education meetings, we have no idea what's happening until the Starbucks pops up and then somebody's walking a poodle across the street, and then you're like, I think something's about to happen here. That something was planned a long time ago, but we had no idea. So civic engagement goes past just voting, but how do we make sure that, maybe one quarter you say, all right, Sister Sally, this is your quarter to go to city council. Brother John, this is your quarter to go to county commission. And if we hear something that comes up, then we come back and we report it to the church. This is something we need to be aware of. But if we're not in the room, as they say, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And too often our issues are getting served up because we have no idea what's happening.
Let me throw out some names. You mentioned that it's a lie that the church is bought into. Let me throw out some names that will help us to identify how this is a lie. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos. The whole purpose for God raising up prophets is so that those prophets can go and speak to the king. There's nothing more political than a prophet going and telling the king he's wrong.
Right. And when every year that I go and, we lobby Congress, so different groups that I'm part of, we go. And when you look in the congressional directory, it shows you their religious affiliation. And we have no A.M.E. Zion members seated in Congress. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I'm thinking of a generation or two ago when we did have very powerful A.M.E. Zion members in Congress, but I'm surprised that we do not now.
Yeah. So just thinking about where our interests are being represented, who are we raising up? And I think that one of the issues that really bother me is like the perfect candidate. It's almost like we're always looking for the perfect candidate. So as soon as like something comes out like, oh, well, this person, oh, well, they can't be our candidate. Alabama was about to elect a man who couldn't even go to the mall because he was so atrocious. And they had absolutely no. So like some of the little things that people do in their 20s. Now, if they're still doing these things, like, that's a whole other conversation. But if someone has done something in their past, that should not automatically disqualify them from leadership. But sometimes those stories get planted in our community to get us to turn against our own and say, oh no, they can't represent us. But then we end up voting for someone who's done something probably 10 times worse and don't even have our best interest at heart.
Yes. Good. Glad to have you, Dr. Norman. So glad to have you with us tonight. Let's climb down off of that soapbox.
I got a lot of boxes.
Well, we both do. Let's climb down off of that one and return to our previous discussion of stewardship. In particular, since we're talking about economic development at this point, the article mentions the stewardship of financial transparency. Talk about the importance of our being transparent with finances in the church.
I mean, I got to think for a second about, where to go, because what immediately came to mind is probably not what I should be saying right now. But I think that, it requires a great deal of trust for people to make sacrificial offerings. And I think in a lot of instances, we are asking people to sacrifice for things that they don't trust. And the way that you instill trust is through transparency. So if you're asking me to participate in something that I cannot see or understand, then you ought not be surprised when I decide not to make that decision, especially when you have a history and sometimes a tendency to not make the best decisions. And so I think that it is incumbent upon the leadership to consider the ask that they make and how those resources are being utilized, because you have a lot of local churches that are struggling to sustain themselves, but then they're being asked to sacrifice for something that they cannot see the benefit of. How'd I do, y'all?
Oh, you were very diplomatic with that one. But it's these small things. If you're talking about scripture, if we're faithful over a few things, then we'll become rules over many. So if we're faithful and transparent about the $3 and $4 offerings that we receive, then we can start looking for the $3,000 and $4,000 offerings. But if we're not faithful over $3 and $4, how then can we handle more?
Right. Because, and I think that, we ask for people to give, and a lot of churches now don't really fault the churches, but I think there's just like some training that probably needs to be provided where people are, creating budgets just to cover operational expenses. So my question is like, well, where's your budget for ministry? Where's your budget for community outreach? Where's your budget for, youth programs? Because that's what people give to. And then you say like, all right, we're going to put 30% toward our outreach and then 70% goes toward outreach. People are more focused on that 30%, what they can see happening in the community, what they can see happening with the young adults. And then you say like, all right, and then out of that $100, we're going to take the other 70 to pay our bills and to pay our claims and to do these things. But you got to make sure that there's some things happening that the people can get excited about that are demonstrations of our witness. But if we can never see a demonstration of our witness through our finances, then why are you asking me to continue to give when I can give to this nonprofit where I know that they're feeding the homeless? I can give to my sorority because I know the missions that they're engaged in. So it's not that people don't have the money to give, but they can't see where their giving is going if it's only for operational expenses.
Right. So glad that you brought that out. Let's close our conversation tonight with what are you seeing as trends moving forward or areas moving forward wherein churches need to rethink and re-engage in ministry in their communities?
So I think the biggest trend that I'm seeing is the right sizing of buildings. So a lot of churches are in spaces that are really big and they're not seeing as many people that will fill up that space. And so there are a lot of churches that are starting to look at how do we right size our space. So we might occupy a smaller space for worship, but then we might turn some of that space into community meeting rooms. We might turn some of that space into I was just in Philadelphia and we went to a Baptist church that had a labyrinth, and it's something that's open to the community. And
why don't you help us understand what a labyrinth is?
Right, because I had to ask that question because to me it just looked like a big mat on the floor, and I was like, so, and they were like, we got a grant for the labyrinth, and I was like, so what do you do? And people were like, wow. So it's like kind of like a maze that you can walk around, and you're supposed to like have contemplative thought, and people can walk in groups so they can walk singularly. But it kind of like
certain points in labyrinths, there are certain prayers that are said as you reach certain spots in that labyrinth.
Right. So there's a whole spiritual aspect that I've never seen in the Black church, none. So I was like totally, fascinated, but it's something that's open to the community. And again, it's like an educational tool that you can utilize, a way to help bring people closer to God. So it's like, we'll open up the fellowship for a Zumba class, but are we opening up the fellowship hall for things that will help bring people closer to God? So, looking at our space, not only for worship, but, what are some other ways that we can help people to experience God in their everyday lives using our space? And especially inviting community groups to come in and have meetings, because people who may not have ever been in your church, if my nonprofit is having a meeting there, then it's like, oh wow, like I've never seen this church, and the people who are here, like they actually seem kind of nice. I might come visit sometime. Inviting that community group to come to the church and maybe tell the church a little bit about what they're working on. Then the church is like, oh wow, had no idea this organization existed. Maybe I'll donate. Maybe I'll volunteer. And that's how you really start to get connected with the community while also using your space in a really productive way. I was disappointed during the pandemic that we didn't see more churches opening their fellowship hall for kids. I'm a work from home mom, so my son had the benefit of being home with me every day. But my heart really broke for for the parents who had to go to work and their kids didn't have a place to go and they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. So I think after school programs, senior care centers, there's so many needs in our community that we don't have to try to meet all those needs. But if we can identify one need that we can use our space to meet, then I think that also helps to make that connection with the community.
So one of the things that we have to rethink in terms of ministry is our previous understanding that the church is only for worship.
Right.
You know,
But it can't. The question is like, what is worship, right? Because is worship only what we do on Sunday, or is worship how do we turn our hearts to God in appreciation for all the things that God has done? And that can not only be done through as worship service, but also through our work, because some people consider their work as a part of their worship. Some people
but
consider education. Yeah.
But the local links group, is that part of worship as well?
Depends on what programs they have.
Okay.
Because a lot of those organizations are Christian-based organizations, or they have a Christian component. So if their mission is to help, raise the quality of education for young people, why would we not want to be a part of that?
Okay. All right. All right. I guess you raise a good point there. In terms, and let me also say that one of the articles in this month's issue is on rethinking how we can use our spaces. I think the article exact title is rethinking the use of sacred space for sacred worship. That we have to think about what we're doing with our facilities and how we can better use them to service our communities.
Yeah, and that's by Dr. Napoleon Bradford. So he and Dr. Karen are married, and they are a dynamic ministry couple doing some amazing ministry in Maryland. And they really have taken the challenge to rethink church in a less traditional way. And I think he turned his a part of his church into a community center. And so they open it up for the members of the community for a variety of purposes. And they have some multicultural programs that they offer, because they've seen like the change in the community around the church.
Wonderful, wonderful. You've been watching Practical Conversations for the Life of the Church. Our guest tonight is the Reverend LaKesha Womack, who is the founder and CEO of Rethinking Church Strategies. We have enjoyed having you tonight for our conversation. We encourage everyone to go to her website, and that the address for that is on your screen, as well as her Facebook page. We would hope that we have sparked something or sparked interest in you, that you can further engage and have conversation with her and her team concerning ways in which you can rethink the ministries that you're doing in your own communities. Reverend Womack, we thank you so much for joining us tonight for our practical conversation. We thank those who have tuned in and are watching us live, and who will be watching us on the various Zion platforms later on. We thank you for joining our conversation tonight. We thank you. Have a good night. Thank you very much.